Hi everyone, thanks for coming. Welcome to Learning Composing Through Arranging. This is a talk I've really wanted to put together for a while now. The past few years of working on projects, I have been realizing more and more that the way I approach arranging my cover tracks was also informing the way I compose music. So I'm super excited to share my thought process with you all and hopefully provide you with some new perspectives that you can bring to your own work. My goal with this presentation is to share a little bit about my process and hopefully inspire a new way of thinking or approach that you can take in your own work, as well as to highlight some of the benefits I've noticed from this particular workflow. I don't believe there is a right or wrong way to make and/or learn about music, and in fact, I think by necessity of the creative process, your workflow will likely change constantly, and that's great. In fact, from the time I'm sitting down on my computer to write this to when you're seeing this talk, some of my views will probably have changed. But first, my name is Jeff Penny, and I've been arranging music for about 10 years now. And by the way, I just looked that up because I wasn't sure when my first arrangement came out, but now that I saw that date, I feel super old. Anyway, I've made a number of different covers in a variety of different styles, and some of them have even earned recognition, as you can see listed below. I've also had the honor to contribute to the original music of a number of games, films, advertisements, and more. It's been incredible working as part of so many awesome teams, some of them you can see listed below. And through all of my career in education and composition, there's something that I've heard time and time again, advice, a strategy that I've just been told multiple times. It's that studying scores of great music is one of the most tried and true methods of learning composition. If you've ever formally studied composition, music theory, orchestration, or anything similar, I can almost guarantee that at some point score study was something that you've either done or at the very least had recommended to you. While it's certainly a great way to learn, and I never would try to diminish that, I think it does have its limits. Not everyone learns the same way. Just playing something at a piano and taking notes isn't always going to be enough to internalize a concept for everyone. Especially with something like music or really most arts and creative fields, the best way to learn something is through practical experience. So while I certainly have found score study to be helpful, I don't think that on its own it has made as significant as improvements in my abilities as arranging has. I found that solely focusing on score study didn't really bridge the gap between understanding and internalizing. While I might learn some new harmonic language, orchestration technique, or whatever else, if I didn't internalize those ideas to a point that I was musically fluent in them, they wouldn't come out in my writing without significant effort and intent on my part. That's where making arrangements of music you like comes into play. I view arranging as a more hands-on version of score study, where you not only analyze the music, but put the musical concepts to use in a practical setting. It's not enough to just take someone else's notes and play them. You really need to dig deeper and understand the music in order to be able to make something new. You need to break down the piece to its most fundamental levels in order to understand what makes it so special. And I don't mean in a Schenkerian analysis kind of way. And this is important because as composers for games, having our music sound nice isn't enough. We need to be able to convey or enhance emotions, information, and more through our work. We need to understand at a fundamental level how the music we love is able to convey so much meaning to us, often without saying a word. Plus, not only do you learn a lot, making cover arrangements also has a ton of other benefits. It's a lot of fun getting to flex your creative muscles and work with the music you love. It's also a great way to make friends within an awesome community, a great way to grow your fan base for when you do write original music, and you might even make some money along the way. So then, how do you approach arranging in a way that will give you the most benefit? The first step is to learn the music you're covering inside and out. I like to listen to the track a few times. Even if it's a piece that I absolutely love and I think I know already, when I listen critically, there's often some subtle detail that jumps out at me that I've never appreciated before. Similarly, playing through it on an instrument can be a great way to familiarize yourself with a piece of music, especially when you start trying to play other parts that aren't as emphasized as the main melody is. I like to put a particular emphasis on noticing how the different parts add up to something greater than their sum. Things like different instrumentations and timbres creating specific textures, the way inner lines complement the melody in terms of voice leading and counterpoint, or the way accompaniment rhythms interlock with other parts. I find noticing these kinds of things to be the first step in understanding how everything functions within the piece as a whole. At this stage, I also think about macro considerations such as form, repetition, development, or even the shape of the piece overall. These are aspects that I find most often aren't what we remember the music for, but they're vital to creating its foundation. Analyzing a song's shape can be especially helpful in media composing, where you're often trying to tell a story with your work, where the music needs to travel along a journey with the listener. You can even get the best of both worlds if you actually transcribe the piece. Essentially, you're just doing a score study with more steps. Sometimes I'll literally notate the piece in Sibelius, other times I do a quick piano sketch in MIDI, but I find both of these methods really help me solidify what I'm hearing. Partly because I play them in, which gives me the previously mentioned practical understanding of the piece, but I'm also a very visual learner, so being able to physically see the different pieces connect to one another is extremely helpful for me. So while a lot of step 1 can also be gleaned from traditional score study, I think this particular method really helps prepare you for step 2. When I make an arrangement, I always set out to say something new. There's a time and a place to just perform someone else's music as is, and direct covers can be great. It's just not personally what I'm interested in making, and I don't think it provides the type of learning that I've been describing. Performing the music sort of limits you by just stopping after learning step 1. That's why the next part of my process is to recontextualize the original music. I typically start from one of two places. Either I hear something cool that I want to keep and change everything else around it, or I hear something that I want to change while keeping other aspects the same. For instance, for the keep example, I might hear a really unique harmonic language that I like, and I want to preserve it, so I set out to change the context around that harmonic language. Whereas in the change example, I might start by purposefully wanting to change the harmonic language while maintaining other aspects. The most common examples of this change approach being changing the instrumentation from one set of instruments to another. Either approach is indistinguishable from the other when you're finished, but it's just about how you get to wherever it is you're trying to go. You don't have to focus on technical musical aspects that you want to keep or change either. In fact, I often like to think in terms of emotion. So one of the things I really try to consider is whether I want to change or keep elements like the emotional tone, the energy level, or similar more abstract concepts. For instance, when arranging the main theme from The Last of Us, one of the things I really loved was how human and intimate it felt to me. The way you can hear the fingers on the strings, the instrumentation, it all just made it feel so personal. So while I knew I was arranging it for string quartet, I sought out techniques that had a bit more grit and humanness to them, like overpressure on the bow, Bartok pits, large dynamic shifts, or tapping on the instruments and stomping on the floor. Things that the Videri String Quartet really brought out in their performance and made it feel more intimate and human. Another important consideration to note here is that I like to keep my ideas loose at this point and stay flexible. If I get too fixated on a specific concept this early on in the process, I can sometimes wind up trying to force an idea that just won't sound good. And believe me, that never turns out well, either for the music or for your mental health. Up until this point, we had just observed the different parts that make up the music. But now we're going to start thinking about how each of those parts is functioning and how we can change the context of those functions to recontextualize the original piece. We can either choose to swap a part out for a different one that has the same function, swap it for a part with a totally different function, or just keep it as is depending on the concept you settled on. Let's take reharmonization for example, because that's probably the most classic example of swapping out bits of music for other bits that have the same function. If in your concept you decide that you wanted to preserve the original melody exactly as is, and you like the general feeling of the harmony, one way you could recontextualize it is by swapping out the chords for others with the same harmonic function. After all, functional harmony in Western classical music theory really lends itself to this idea of swapping out functions, and then thinking about chords in terms of their functions within the greater harmonic structure. Change your predominant chord to a different predominant chord. Add some passing chords. Resolve your voice leading in a similar way. Now you've recontextualized the melody without changing how anything from the original functions. In this regard, I think music theory knowledge can be extremely helpful at allowing you to work creatively and efficiently. But even if you aren't familiar with those terms and systems, hang in there with me for a minute because I think there's another way to frame this concept. Take this cat, for example. This cat doesn't understand music theory. All it knows is hanging out, being cute, and doing whatever it wants because it's a cat. And really, you just need to be like this cat. Yes, there's all sorts of academic terms we can use to describe a harmony's function in a piece of music, but if we really want to be reductive, they all come down to creating shape and/or color, or creating a pattern of calm, tension, and release that tells a story, or simply just setting a tone and feeling. So even if this cat can't tell me how some chords are just an expansion of the dominant before a deceptive cadence, it can still feel if it is tensed or relaxed or whatever emotion. You can still feel how that first chord is creating tension and how the second chord is creating that release. We can hear what color each chord is adding to the scene, even if we don't know what they're called. We can still feel what each color brings and try to find a new chord that creates that same color. Let's take the example of Over the Rainbow. Here's a super quick mock-up of what that might sound like for solo piano, with a relatively faithful to the original performance and harmony. And now, let's take a listen to Sun Ra's version of Over the Rainbow. As you can hear, most of the chords are functioning differently, but the big points of tension and release, especially around the ends of phrases, are still there. So in some ways, you could say he maintained their context, but he also changed quite a lot to heighten the journey. He understood the function that the harmony was playing in the original song and recontextualized the melody by playing with those expectations. By working through this process, you're not only internalizing how the original chords were functioning in terms of their chord function, harmonic rhythm, voicings, etc., but you're also learning how you can choose to change, subvert, or give them a new perspective while still supporting the melody. You might even choose to change the function entirely, but you'll have a deeper understanding of why you wanted to do that in the first place and what your new piece is saying. While harmony was just my first example, this can really go for any aspect of music as well. For instance, texture can be broken down into its functions of instrumentation, number of independent voices or timbre. Tempo, meter, and rhythm can all be analyzed for their amount of motion, for their groove, or their metric stresses. Anything that can be pulled apart from the original music can be broken down in this way and recontextualized into something new. And the best part about this is that it goes both ways. By working through it, not only are you internalizing how the original music works, but you're also learning about the musical elements that you're arranging them into. Take this cover of Natsu Yuzora that I did, for example. Working through the original piece, I learned about the kinds of harmonies, melodic shapes, and textures that it uses, all of which were fairly different than the type of music I typically write. Then, in addition to the musical elements I observed in the original, I wrote my arrangement for harp, koto, and shakuhachi. 3 instruments I'd never really arranged for before, so I was able to learn from the recontextualization process as well. For instance, writing for the harp, I realized just how often I rely on chromatic motion and some ways that I could get around that while still communicating the same ideas. And this isn't just hypothetical either. After doing that arrangement, I have since used all 3 instruments in original pieces I've written, a skill I probably never would have had available to me if I hadn't worked through them with this arrangement. It's a big reason that I like to do covers in a totally different style than the original piece. Sure, I find it more fun and I'm able to have a lot more creative freedom, but I also just learn a lot more by doing it as well. It nearly doubles the amount of information you're able to learn from every arrangement you create, and it's a great musical challenge to figure out how functions can relate across different styles of music or different idioms. The final step of this process is to find the soul of the music, and I promise that's not nearly as pretentious as it sounds at first. This step is one that I would argue is the most important because it's where you really put that knowledge you gained in the previous steps to the test. Just recontextualizing the original melody isn't really enough. You still need to maintain the identity of the original piece. Otherwise, is it even a cover anymore? Sure, I could take a piece of music and add a drum beat to it, but I don't know that that really qualifies as saying something new or bringing something new to the music. There might be a time and a place for that, but it's not really much of an arrangement that you can learn from. Similarly, I could change everything to the point that it doesn't even feel like the same piece of music anymore. Even if it is technically the same melodic idea, it's just a melody shoehorned into a completely different track. That's why the key here is to find that middle ground, to be able to recontextualize the piece in a way that you're bringing something new and fresh to the music, while still maintaining its core identity, or its soul. The soul of the piece also isn't some tangible, definitive thing. It might change from person to person, or even from listen to listen. Finding a correct answer here really isn't the point. It's just about finding the defining feature or features that resonate with you. What connects you to the original piece? It's about finding what the heart of the music is for you and finding a way to enhance that in a different setting. Your job as the arranger is to figure out how far you can bend the original material while still retaining its core identity. If you're able to do that, you'd be surprised how far your creativity can take you, all while working within the framework of the original musical ideas. Let's look at this example of Battle 1 from the Octopath Traveler soundtrack. The defining features of that piece that I wanted to preserve were its melody and its energy. Everything else was fair game to change, including the tempo, which I decided to slow down quite a bit. In fact, I had had multiple people tell me they were initially skeptical that I could make a battle theme still work with a tempo that had been so drastically slowed down, but that they were surprised at how well it actually worked when I finished the track. Those comments were actually a big impetus for me wanting to put this talk together in the first place. In this case, I left the melody pretty much as is, so that part of the arrangement was fairly straightforward. But my goal here was to maintain the piece's energy. And sure, a lot of the original energy did come from the tempo, but I would say it was the groove and bombastic instrumentation that did most of the heavy lifting in that regard. Therefore, given what we've already discussed, I can substitute that out for a different groove and a different bombastic instrumentation while still maintaining the core function, making the tempo irrelevant to the identity of the piece. And it's worth noting that I'm only able to explain this so succinctly in hindsight. Actually working on projects requires a lot more trial and error to find what works and what doesn't. It's never as straightforward in practice as how I'm presenting it now for clarity. So if you're actually working on your own project and can't swap out the functions as simply as I'm explaining it here, don't be discouraged. I'd like to point out two things. The first being that, like any other skill, the more you do it, the more efficient you'll become at it. And the second being that in some ways, I think it's almost better to have to experiment because it really enforces what you're learning. As an aside, to make this a little bit easier, if I'm making a really extreme change, I oftentimes like to make a proof of concept mockup. Usually this is just a sketch of the core elements that I want to change, and that way I can figure out if they actually work together before committing myself to making an entire arrangement. So in this instance, I might just have created a quick drum beat at the tempo, put the melody over it, played on a piano, and just made sure that it felt okay first. But even when I do these sketches, I always have to refine my idea as I go along. This experimentation can be the most rewarding part of the process, though. By the time you've successfully found the soul of the piece, and you've found the direction that you want to take it, I believe you'll already have internalized quite a lot of the musical elements. Most of the time, the soul will include the melody, but it doesn't always have to. Or as in my Octopath Traveler arrangement, it could be more than just a melody. Rhythm, emotion, textures, dynamics, harmony, form, meter, tempo, any of these things or more can make up the core of the piece. It all just comes down to you and the particular music that you're working with. To give another example, when I listen to I Will Become a Cat from the show Fruits Basket, the main thing that jumps out at me is just how fluid it is. It has an ebb and a flow, a push and a pull of the tempo and phrasing, as well as a flowing lyrical melody. With my arrangement, I wanted to preserve that fluidity and that feeling. I did that by not recording to a strict and even click track. I wanted to bring out that narrative shape and phrasing by exaggerating the dynamics and the texture. Elements that present themselves differently by the necessity of the original mostly being a solo piano arrangement. I also attempted to bring out that emotion, not just through the obvious things like instrumentation, but I tried to add a lot more color to the harmonies, making use of the limited number of voices to really bring out those moments of tension and release. I wanted to take each finger of the pianist and make it an independent voice while still having them feel connected. By having each instrument dance around one another and melodic ideas jump from part to part, I tried to make them intertwine while still being their own melodic ideas. Once I've worked through all those previous steps, and once I've identified the soul of the piece, recontextualized it, and absorbed all that I can, I'm ready to put that new knowledge to use. But how do we do that? Now that we've gained all these new skills, how do we put them to use as a composer? I think the most obvious, surface level answer is one we've already talked about. Once you've internalized all these musical concepts through analysis and recontextualization, there are now colors that you have access to in your compositional palette. When I write an arrangement, I often find that the new things I've learned come out significantly more naturally in my original works than if I had tried to learn them from score study alone. Let's take this piece of music I wrote for the upcoming visual novel The Game of Fortune as an example. It came after I had written the battle arrangement that you had heard earlier. In this piece, I used a similar instrumentation of rock instruments, plus massive drums, orchestra, and synthesizers to create an energy to the music, all of which was being supported by a high lyrical, sweeping melody on top, something that is very much taken from that battle arrangement from Octopath that you heard earlier. And as a matter of fact, years ago, I did an arrangement of Satsuki's theme from Kill la Kill, and I've never released it for various reasons, but it's been a major influence on my composition since. The extensive use of horn melody, landing on really crunchy notes on hard downbeats, and the use of big cutouts with solo instruments coming back in are elements that I use extensively throughout my work ever since I did that arrangement years and years ago. It's something that I developed into a style and into my own artistic voice that all came from breaking down someone else's work in this process. Without having made those arrangements, I might not have been able to so easily reach for those colors when it came time to compose this piece. Everything we write is an expression of ourselves up until that point, and a reflection on what our artistic voice is. Therefore, anything I write, I view as an amalgamation of everything I've absorbed from my life previous to that moment. This piece in particular heavily showing my influence from those two arrangements that I mentioned. But that isn't enough to be a good composer for games or most media, really. As composers, just being able to write interesting music that people want to listen to isn't enough. Our music actively needs to enhance the gameplay in some form or another. That can be emotionally supporting a scene, guiding the player through a mission, or really any other way you can think of that the music can work in tandem with the project and not just on top of it. Rather than just being there to sound cool, it has to express something to the audience. I'm sure we all have examples of music in games that have moved us. Examples where the game just wouldn't have been the same without the music that we love so much. But why? How are these pieces able to convey such complex ideas, typically without speaking a single word? Well, that's actually what we just figured out through arranging. When you distill a piece down to its core, to its soul, you're left with its primary message. Take Spiral Mountain from Banjo-Kazooie, for example. My primary read would be that the track is fun, energetic, and a little bit quirky. The bouncy melody, the contrasting counter melodies, and the use of instrumentation, traditional or otherwise, gives it a really fun character. The near constant 16th note pulse and the staccato accompaniments give it its energy. And the use of chromatic passing tones, secondary dominance, and mode mixture really give it a lot of quirkiness. For my concept, I distilled it down to these elements the best I could, recontextualized them, and then creating something new with a similar emotional tone. I kept the melody pretty much as is, moving the counter melody around the arrangement as needed. I did change the instrumentation, which I feel does make it lose some of its fun factor, but I think it makes up for it through its shonen anime opening inspiration, giving it a different type of fun identity. I recontextualized the 16th note drive by speeding up the tempo a lot and adding rhythmic energy in the rhythm guitar and drums. I left the harmony pretty much as is because I love the quirkiness it brings. Plus, I think those kind of harmonic ideas fit better in a genre like J-rock than they would in other types of rock. Now, having gotten to the core of the piece and having internalized how the music was able to say what it does, I have the tools to better convey those same ideas through my own music. If a game needs fun, energy, or quirk, I now have musical ideas at my disposal in two different forms to give. And of course, these ideas can be extrapolated out to any piece of music and what they might say to the listener. How does a piece of music convey the setting of the game? How does it convey its emotional tone? How does it convey the tension or intensity level increasing? These are all questions we need to be able to answer as composers, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel. If we break down music that has already said it, we can better understand how to answer those questions with our own work. That's what this process has been about. A secondary benefit of this process for media composers might be slightly more controversial. I think that making arrangements and being able to figure out their essence is also immensely helpful in dealing with temp tracks and references that you're given. Whether you like them or not, temp tracks are very much part of being a composer for games. Sure, some teams are going to give you a lot of creative freedom to do whatever you want, but if you work on enough projects, I don't think it's possible to have a career where you never have to deal with them in one capacity or another. While you aren't going to be specifically making arrangements of those temp tracks, being able to distill them down to their core concepts is an incredibly useful skill. Sure, it helps you quickly convey the same information they do, but I think it goes even further than that. In our arrangements, we learn how to maintain the identity of the piece by figuring out what we can change and what we need to keep the same. With temp tracks, this works in reverse. We need to figure out what we need to change in order to make it our own, while still using a similar musical vocabulary. So by doing more and more arrangements, I found this process only got easier and easier as I can more quickly find the core of a reference track and extrapolate out what I can change it to while still maintaining the same kind of message for the listener. The final benefit of thinking this way is simply that the process allows you a lot of creative freedom to try new things and experiment. I mentioned that I like to move as far away from the original as possible, but I also like to purposefully do it in an ambitious way that helps me learn new skills. In every arrangement I do, I like to make sure there is something new that I've never done before in it. In the case of this arrangement I did of Shout Baby, every single instrument in the orchestra was a live player, and it took me a lot of work to take a ton of different recordings of different people in different spaces with different equipment and make them all sound like one orchestra playing together. But that skill set I developed is now one I can bring to my own compositions on games. I think this is a nice demonstration that it's also not just about learning music theory techniques. Things like mixing or recording techniques, how to do a remote recording without a steady click track, and just so much more. All of these are skills that I first tried out in arrangements I made and then was able to later utilize in my own music. So it's not even just strictly about compositional concepts that you can learn from, it's about this whole process as well. In summary, by following this process for making arrangements, I feel I have become a better composer. By absorbing, breaking apart, piecing back together, and making something new from a piece of music, I internalized not only the individual musical elements, but the language it used to convey meaning to its audience. That internalized language is something that I can now use to tell my own stories. As I mentioned at the start of this talk, there isn't one right way to achieve any of this process, and I believe every person and project needs their own workflow. But my hope is that framing it in this way and thinking about the steps of your own process can help you better understand what you can take away and use in your own work. If you're someone who makes arrangements already, try thinking about them in these terms and see if you can find new ways to learn from the process. And if you simply want to be a better composer but have never tried making a cover before, give it a try and see how beneficial it can be. Plus, the more you use a skill, the better you get at it, so why not just give it a shot? I need to take a moment to give a huge thank you to VGMCon and its organizers. Thank you so much for having me and facilitating this talk and just putting together this awesome convention. I also have to thank the incredible musicians, composers, and artists whose work was featured or referenced in this talk, as well as Tyler Ganelli, James C. Hoffman, and Joe Newman for proofreading my script and making sure that what you just heard actually sort of made sense. And of course, thank you very much for listening to what I had to say. I hope you learned something or were inspired to go out and put more awesome music in the world. I'm going to be answering some of your questions live in just a moment, but first I wanted to put my contact info up on the screen. Just in case I don't have time to get to your question, or in case you have any questions in the future, you can always feel free to get in touch. I'm always more than happy to help. I always love having new people that I can nerd out about music with. And if you want to follow me and be alerted when I have any new educational content, if you enjoyed this, or if you want to hear any of my future music, please feel free to follow me on any of the social media listed there. Thank you. So first we have a fairly big question, which is how do I approach combining multiple remote recordings? And I know that was asked specifically about the full orchestra. That could honestly be like a whole video essay in and of itself. So I'm going to give a brief answer, but if people do want to know like a full breakdown of how I do that, I could actually make a separate video on that. So please tell me if there's interest in that. But the very basic idea is that if there's something like strings or things that make into a section, that's my first approach, is I take the different recordings and I focus on making them sound like one section playing together first. And I start on that the very like small level. It kind of depends how it was recorded. If it was multiple different people, that can be usually a bit easier. If it was a bunch of recordings done by the same people or same person, then there's sometimes phase issues or they could sound too similar and it sounds a little artificial. So I might EQ them differently. I might change things. I might just do little tweaks to make them a little bit different and sound like multiple real people instead of one real person. It's also really great if the person recording does it on different instruments too. That can really help make it sound like a live section. But anyway, I start by making a small section. Then I work by going to the next largest section. So like in the case of an orchestra, that'd be the strings. So I might start, make sure the basses sound like a section, cello sounds like a section, viola sounds like a section, etc. And then I work to make sure the strings as a whole sound like a section and they sound like a string section on a stage. Then I'll do the same thing for the woodwinds, same thing for the brass, etc. This also applies to non-orchestra. Orchestras is the most complicated, so I'm going with that explanation first. And then once I have each section sounding good on its own, I balance them against each other, which is debatably the best step here because I eventually have to think about space. And that's really the big one that I hear issues for a lot of people is getting them to sound like they're in the right space, because just because each section is balanced against each other won't make it sound like a real orchestra, because in a real orchestra, you're not equally distant from every single player. So you want to make sure that not only are they panned correctly to the spot in the stage, but you want to make sure that like the drums sound really far back on the stage versus the strings that are right up front versus the brass and woodwinds that might be more towards the middle. So really dialing in EQ and reverb to make sure that they have the depth, not only just the side to side correct, but having the depth correct is really what goes a long way for getting it to sound like a real ensemble playing together. And it's super time consuming because each of these steps, after I do the next one, I have to backtrack and go back to the previous one and make sure everything's sounding okay. So it's a lot of small tweaking, but that's kind of the general overview. And like I said, if anyone is interested, I could make a longer video on that with more detail. The next question I has is, what extent do you try to get your hands on the score versus transcribing by ear? And the honest answer to that one is what my intentions are and how much time I have. If I don't have time, I'll just look at the score and work from that. And if I'm not, like, there are purposely arrangements I do where my goal is to learn something from it. And if I'm trying to learn from it, I will do it by ear because there's no point in just looking at the score for all the reasons I outlined. I don't learn as much from that. So if I have the time and my goal is to learn, I will always just do it by ear. But if I don't have a lot of time, I will sometimes look at the score. Or if I just like am not entirely sure about what I'm hearing, I might cross-reference it with sheet music. But usually it's just doing it by ear. And then how much expertise do I need to get good like this? I'm sure this was not just 10 years of arranging to get to this. This was built on a strong foundation too, it looks. And I mean, yes, I don't only do arranging and that instantly made me better at composing. That obviously isn't totally how it works. But I did start arranging. I arranged for years before, maybe like 2 years before I ever tried writing anything original. And I feel like I would have just been so lost trying to do something original if I hadn't had that experience arranging before. And like, this is the kind of a nebulous question, so it's a little bit hard to answer. But my point here is just that arranging makes you better as a composer, but you also have to practice composing and do your own composing legwork, I guess, to get better at that as well. You can't just do the one without the other. And sorry, it's a little bit of a hard question to ask, but always feel free to reach out later if you want something more specific. When approaching a cover, how do you avoid spending too much time on something and just saying something versus just saying something that's good enough? And that is something I will always struggle with, not just on covers, but on literally everything. I have a tendency to want to tweak every little detail that won't actually make a difference. And deadlines are really great for this. When I work on a game, I usually have a deadline, so that works. But if I don't have a deadline because it's a project I'm doing for myself, I will make a deadline for myself because otherwise I will endlessly tweak things. And honestly, that's kind of the best I have, is just forcing myself to stop at a certain point. And also a big thing that also helps is giving myself a lot of distance. I will work on something for a while and then I'll stop for, I don't know, it depends how much time I can. But if I don't listen to something for a week and I come back to it, I will feel like I have a much clearer vision of how it's sounding and what I can do. And that just gives me a better perspective on if I actually need to keep tweaking things or if I could call something finished. And that really helps me too. Also, getting second opinions. Like I mentioned in my talk, James C. Hoffman, who I have listened to like everything I do. And if he says it sounds good, I trust him. When approaching a cover, how do you determine what genre to switch it into to maximize your learning? I don't necessarily... Okay, sometimes I think about maximizing my learning, and that's usually if I want to learn about a specific style. I'll go in the opposite direction and I'll say, what piece of music can I use that will translate well into this style? So I'm maximizing my learning in that sense, in that I have an end goal set up of where I'd like to switch to. But mostly it's just that I'm picking something that musically makes sense in my head, and then I will learn something from it, but I'm not actively picking the style to maximize anything. Producing a full cover takes a lot longer than just score study or analysis. How do you decide what cover practice is worth the time and worth your energy versus looking at a score? That's a good question too, but again, it kind of just comes down to time and what I have. Most of the time when I do a cover, it's just because I want to do it. I'm currently working on a cover of One Summer's Day that should hopefully be out in the next month or two. I'm really hoping. But I have been working on that cover for a little over a year and a half now. I'm totally open to having insane timelines that I will work on, because I'm doing them because I want to make it and I know what I want to put out into the world and what I want to end up as. And if it takes forever, that's totally fine. That's just kind of how it happens. But if I'm actively doing it because I want to learn something, like if I have a game that's in a specific style and I want to learn something for that specific game, I obviously won't have time to spend almost 2 years on an arrangement to learn about it. That's just not feasible. So in those studies, I might just do a score study, or I might just make a short arrangement that I never actually release, because I do that too. Like the Kill la Kill one I actually mentioned in my talk. Are there any specific books you recommend on these practices? I am terrible. I don't read instructional stuff, which I think is part of why I did this whole talk. I don't learn as well from reading things. I kind of have to do them. And so I really don't have books I recommend for these practices. But the thing I do recommend for this, specifically for arranging, is to just kind of listen to what other people have done and get inspired and break down in pretty much the same format I talked about in this talk. Break down arrangements that you have heard and you love and figure out what they do and work on it. I feel like that's a non-answer, but I just don't read instructional stuff like that too much. So fortunately, how do you go about arranging a tune in a genre you might be unfamiliar with? That's also a great question. Main two things I do are I listen to that genre a lot and I break down things I hear commonly in that genre. So like that J-Rock example, I had never, ever touched J-Rock before, or even really rock or anything. And I took a bunch of J-Rock that I really like and broke it down and thought about it. For that one specifically, I was actually listening to a bunch of Scandal, which coincidentally I'm wearing their shirt. But I listened to a bunch of Scandal tracks and listened to what the guitar riffs were sounding like, the way the guitar rhythms worked, the way the drums worked, and I interpolated that into something new. I also talk to people who do write this genre. Like again, with that specific talk, I talked to Mason Lieberman a bunch because he will always be happy to talk about J-Rock or anime music. And he gave me a lot of advice on things that are typically idiomatic of that style. And then the last thing is just using the musicians you have at your disposal. Like, I don't write for guitar, or I hadn't written for guitar at that point. So I just talk to Alejandro and I talk to Andrew and I say, okay, here's the guitar part I wrote. What are your notes on it? And just getting that feedback obviously makes the arrangement better because they know guitar better than I do. But it also means that next time I write for guitar, I now have that new information and I learned it from them. Doesn't have to be guitar. I've done that with many instruments. Like I mentioned with harp, I always asked Niall for advice, just things like that. If you want to encourage people who are not professional arrangers, composers, what you tell them to keep their spirits up? I think you mean in terms of having other people make their work and put it out there. It's just do it because it's fun. That's the main thing. If you enjoy it, that's the main thing. That's why I do it. While I talked about all the benefits of doing it, the only reason I make these arrangements is because I find it fun. Like I find composing fun too, but since I'm doing it for work, it can get kind of stressful. This is just a thing that's for me that I enjoy. So if you do get stressed about it or worried that you're not good enough or whatever possible worry it is, it doesn't really matter how good it is as long as you're having fun. If you're trying to do it professionally, yeah, maybe different story. But as long as you're enjoying it, just that's the main thing to focus on is what you're getting out of it. I didn't see the second part where people are just starting who don't really know what they're doing. Yeah, same answer though. Just have fun with it and do what you enjoy. Most of my early arranging I did for the pep band at my college, which I don't know if the pep band even liked playing my arrangements, but I had fun doing them, and that was my main motivation to get into it. Oftentimes, when arranging a tune, it's hard for me to tell if the idea is cheesy or if I'm just too stuck in my head about something. How do you tell if it works without being cheesy? Usually, I'm really short on time, but basically, I ask other people if they think it's cheesy. That's a common thing I ask people is, listen to this. Do you think it's cheesy? And also, the second thing I mentioned, which is just I find it fun, so I don't really care if it's cheesy. I enjoy it. Some of my arrangements are going to do better than others, and that's okay. As long as I enjoyed what I made, then that's the main thing. And I believe I'm out of time. Feel free to always get in touch if you have any other questions, and I hope this was helpful. Thanks for coming.